My best friend sent my private journal to my girlfriend's parents to prove I was unstable, then told me he did it because he loved me and couldn't let me destroy my life. When I begged him to stop, he wiped his eyes and said, "I'm doing this because you won't help yourself." I didn't say a word. That was 6 months ago. Yesterday, he was crying in my mother's arms on my doorstep. I got a text from my girlfriend Jana a few weeks ago that made my stomach drop. She said we needed to talk about something my best friend Matthew had told her. I called her, and she sounded confused and worried. Matthew had messaged her on Instagram saying he was concerned about our relationship and shared some pretty personal stuff about my past. He told her that my last girlfriend Faith left me because I got possessive and wouldn't give her space. He also said I had trust issues because my dad left when I was younger. The thing is, my dad didn't leave us. He died of cancer 2 years ago, and Matthew was the one who held me together during that whole nightmare. He slept on my couch for weeks, making sure I ate and showered. I was completely confused why he would twist that story. My first instinct was to defend him. I told Jana that Matthew probably just remembered it wrong or was trying to help her understand me better. But Jana seemed genuinely worried about the possessiveness claim. After we hung up, I kept thinking about it and finally texted Faith, my ex, asking why we really broke up. Her response made my blood run cold. She said Matthew had messaged her months before our breakup, claiming I was already planning to propose and had picked out a ring. The truth was, I had only told Matthew I could see myself marrying her someday. Matthew had turned that casual comment into evidence that I was moving way too fast. Faith admitted this had freaked her out and made her question everything about our relationship. I started thinking about my ex before Faith and reluctantly texted her too. Same exact pattern. Matthew had contacted Mia, claiming I was still hung up on the girl before her and wasn't emotionally available. I sat in my car trying to process what was happening. Matthew wasn't just my best friend, he was like a brother to me. We met in college during orientation week and had been inseparable ever since. He was the guy who drove 4 hours to pick me up when my car broke down last year. This manipulation felt impossible to be the same person who brought me soup when I had the flu and never asked for anything in return. I printed out all the Instagram messages and drove to our usual coffee spot where Matthew was already waiting. I handed him the screenshots and he immediately admitted it was true, but his explanation made my head spin. He said he was trying to help them understand me better because I don't open up easily to people. He thought if they knew about my struggles, they would be more patient with me. The way he said it sounded so caring and concerned that for a moment I almost believed him. Part of me still wanted to believe him, but then I pressed harder asking why he lied about my dad leaving, and the real truth started coming out. Matthew admitted he had recently been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and explained that every time I got serious with someone, he would panic that I would stop needing him as a friend. The manipulation had been gradual at first. He would plant seeds of concern in my girlfriend's minds while simultaneously giving me advice that made me second-guess my own relationship instincts. When I got home, I called our mutual friend Chris to see if Matthew had ever given him relationship advice. Chris confirmed my suspicions. Matthew had warned him that his girlfriend was probably cheating because she was being secretive about her phone. This led Chris to become paranoid and controlling, which ultimately caused the exact breakup Matthew had predicted. The next day, Jana called me upset because Matthew had messaged her again. This time, he said he was worried about my mental health since our confrontation and told her I had been acting erratic and might be having a breakdown like after my dad died. I never had a breakdown after my dad died. I went to therapy and processed my grief in a healthy way with professional help that Matthew had actually helped me find. Matthew was now weaponizing my mental health journey against me and making Jana question if I was stable enough for a serious relationship. I decided to confront Matthew one more time, hoping we could work through this as friends. When I got to his apartment, I used the spare key he had given me years ago during a family emergency. Inside, I found him at his computer surrounded by printed screenshots and social media photos of me. He was typing something, and when he saw me, his face went completely pale. On his screen was a detailed message to my mother describing my concerning behavior and his worry that I was isolating myself from people who cared about me. But what made my blood freeze was seeing my own handwriting scattered across his desk, pages from my private journal that I kept locked in my bedroom dresser at my apartment. He said he had been checking on me when I wasn't home to make sure I was okay. He had been reading my most private thoughts for months. Then he showed me his phone where he had Jana's parents' contact information pulled up and a message ready to send about my supposed mental instability. His finger was hovering over the send button, and he looked at me with tears in his eyes, saying he was doing this because he loved me and couldn't let me destroy my life. I realized that Matthew had been inside my apartment countless times reading my journal and probably going through everything I owned. Standing there looking at this person I had trusted for years, I didn't know if I was looking at someone who needed help or someone I needed to be afraid of. I grabbed my journal pages from his desk with shaking hands. Matthew stood up slowly, still holding his phone like a weapon. He wiped his tears and explained that he'd been documenting everything for my own good, in case I ever needed proof of my mental state for insurance or disability claims. The way he twisted his invasion into an act of care made my skin crawl. I told him to delete the message to my mother immediately. He shook his head sadly, saying he couldn't stand by and watch me spiral. His finger moved closer to the send button, and I lunged forward to grab the phone. We struggled briefly before I managed to knock it from his hand. It clattered across the floor, and we both dove for it. I reached it first and quickly deleted the draft message, then checked his sent folder. My heart sank. He'd already sent similar messages to 3 of my coworkers earlier that day. Matthew sat back on his heels, looking genuinely hurt that I'd taken his phone. He started explaining how my behavior at work had been concerning lately, how I'd been distant and irritable. The truth was, I'd been stressed about a big project deadline, something completely normal that he was now painting as a mental health crisis. I scrolled through more of his messages and found weeks of correspondence with people in my life, each one carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt about my stability. I stood up and headed for the door, taking my journal pages with me. Matthew followed, begging me to understand that he was trying to help. He grabbed my arm as I reached the doorway, and his grip was surprisingly strong. He said he couldn't let me leave in this state, that I might hurt myself or someone else. I yanked my arm away and told him to never contact me again. His face crumpled, and he started sobbing loudly, saying I was abandoning him just like everyone else in his life. The drive home felt surreal. My best friend of nearly a decade had been systematically destroying my relationships while pretending to support me. I kept replaying our friendship in my mind, wondering which moments were real and which were manipulation. When I got to my apartment, I immediately checked my bedroom. The lock on my dresser drawer had small scratches around the keyhole that I'd never noticed before. My stomach turned as I realized how many times he must have been in my room while I was at work or sleeping. I called a locksmith and had them come out that night to change every lock in my apartment. While waiting, I went through my phone and blocked Matthew on every platform I could think of. Then I started the difficult task of damage control. I called my boss first, explaining that Matthew was having his own mental health crisis and projecting it onto me. My boss seemed confused, but said he'd noticed I'd been doing excellent work on the project, which contradicted Matthew's claims of erratic behavior. Next, I called my mother. She was already worried because of Matthew's message, but was relieved to hear my voice sounding calm and rational. I explained the situation as simply as I could, that Matthew was struggling with his mental health and had become fixated on me. She remembered how helpful he'd been after Dad died and found it hard to believe, but she trusted me. We agreed she would block his number and let me know if he tried to contact her through other means. The locksmith arrived and changed all my locks within an hour. I gave him an extra tip and asked him to make sure the locks were the best he had. As he worked, I installed a security app on my phone that would alert me to any unusual login attempts on my accounts. I also ordered ordered a small security camera for my apartment entrance, something I never thought I'd need. Jana called while I was setting up the camera. She was crying and confused. Matthew had sent her parents a long message about my supposed instability, complete with out-of-context excerpts from my journal. Her parents were now pressuring her to break up with me for her own safety. I asked if I could come over and explain everything in person. She hesitated but agreed. I gathered all the evidence I had, the screenshots from Faith and Mia, the messages Matthew had sent to various people, and photos of the scratches on my dresser lock. I also brought my journal to show her what Matthew had taken out of context. The drive to her apartment felt like heading into battle. I knew this conversation would determine whether I lost another relationship to Matthew's manipulation. Jana let me in, and I could see she'd been crying for a while. Her laptop was open on the coffee table, showing the message Matthew had sent her parents. I sat down and started from the beginning, showing her the timeline of how Matthew had sabotaged my previous relationships. Her eyes widened as she read Faith and Mia's messages. Then I showed her my journal, pointing out how Matthew had cherry-picked sentences to make me sound unstable. For example, I'd written about feeling angry after a bad day at work, which Matthew had presented as violent tendencies. I'd written about feeling lonely after Faith left, which he'd twisted into suicidal ideation. Every normal human emotion I'd processed privately in my journal had been weaponized against me. Jana started to understand the pattern, but she was still shaken by how convincing Matthew's messages had been. I asked her to call Faith directly, and she agreed. Faith confirmed everything over speakerphone, adding details about how Matthew had contacted her multiple times with increasing urgency about my supposed instability. She said she'd eventually broken up with me not because of who I was, but because the constant warnings from Matthew had made her too anxious to continue. She apologized for not talking to me directly about it at the time. After the call, Jana was fully on my side, but we still had to deal with her parents. She called them and put them on speaker. I calmly explained the situation, acknowledging that it sounded bizarre, but providing evidence for every claim. Her father was skeptical at first, but her mother remembered meeting Matthew and noted that he'd seemed oddly possessive of me even then. They agreed to block Matthew and support whatever decision Jana made about our relationship. With Jana's trust restored, I felt a small victory, but I knew Matthew wouldn't stop. Sure enough, when I got home, there was a note taped to my door. It was from Matthew, written in shaky handwriting, saying he was worried about me and would be checking in regularly to make sure I was safe. The fact that he'd been to my apartment after I'd explicitly told him to stay away sent chills down my spine. I took a photo of the note and checked the security camera I'd just installed. The footage showed Matthew trying his old key in the lock for several minutes before realizing it had been changed. He'd stood there for almost 10 minutes, pressing his ear to the door and knocking softly while calling my name. The timestamp showed this was just an hour after our confrontation at his apartment. I decided to be proactive and went to the police station to file a report. The officer I spoke with seemed sympathetic, but explained that without threats of violence, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I document everything and consider a restraining order if the behavior escalated. I left feeling frustrated, but determined to protect myself. Over the next few days, Matthew's attempts to contact me intensified. He created new social media accounts to message me, called from different phone numbers, and even showed up at my workplace. Each time, he presented himself as a concerned friend trying to help someone in crisis. My coworkers started to feel uncomfortable, and my boss had to ban him from the premises. The breaking point came when I found out Matthew had contacted my therapist. He'd called the office claiming to be my emergency contact and tried to get information about my sessions. Fortunately, my therapist was professional and refused to discuss anything, but she called me immediately to alert me. She also mentioned that Matthew had sounded agitated and had made several comments suggesting I was a danger to myself. I realized I needed to get ahead of this before Matthew's narrative took hold. I compiled all the evidence I had into a clear timeline and created a simple document explaining the situation. I sent this to my close friends, family, and employer, asking them to block Matthew and alert me if he tried to contact them. It felt vulnerable sharing such personal information, but it was better than letting Matthew control the narrative. Most people were supportive, but I could tell some were skeptical. The idea that someone would go to such lengths to sabotage friendships seemed too extreme to believe. Chris was particularly helpful, as he'd experienced Matthew's manipulation firsthand. He shared his own story with our friend group, which helped validate my experiences. I also decided to research borderline personality disorder to better understand what Matthew might be experiencing. While I felt sympathy for his mental health struggles, I couldn't allow his condition to excuse the harm he was causing. I learned about the intense fear of abandonment that often accompanies BPD and how it can lead to desperate attempts to maintain relationships. It helped explain Matthew's behavior, but didn't make it acceptable. The security camera footage became my lifeline over the following weeks. Matthew appeared at my door almost every night, sometimes multiple times. He would stand there for extended periods, occasionally leaving notes or small gifts. One morning I found a framed photo of us from college tucked against my door with a message written on the back about how he missed his best friend. The handwriting was shaky, almost desperate. My workplace situation deteriorated rapidly. Despite my boss's initial support, Matthew's persistent contact was creating problems. He would call the reception desk claiming to be my doctor, my lawyer, or even my brother. When those tactics failed, he started showing up during lunch hours, approaching my coworkers in the parking lot. He would express deep concern about my mental state, showing them carefully edited excerpts from my journal. Several coworkers began avoiding me, unsure what to believe. The human resources department called me in for a meeting. They had received multiple reports of concern from employees who had been approached by Matthew. While they understood my position, they explained that the disruption to the workplace was becoming untenable. They suggested I take some personal time to resolve the situation. It wasn't a suspension, they assured me, but it felt like one. Matthew's campaign was working exactly as he'd planned. I spent my forced time off documenting everything meticulously. I created spreadsheets tracking every appearance at my door, every fake social media account, every message sent to people in my life. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Matthew's attempts followed my daily routine perfectly. He knew when I left for work, when I returned, when I went grocery shopping. He had studied my life like a subject in an experiment. My mother called one afternoon, her voice trembling. Matthew had shown up at her house again, this time with a folder of my journal entries and what he claimed were concerning text messages. He'd spent 2 hours with her, methodically going through each piece of evidence that I was spiraling. He'd even brought articles about adult children who hide mental health crises from their parents. My mother, already worried about me since my father's death, was deeply shaken. I drove to her house immediately. She was sitting at her kitchen table with Matthew's folder spread out before her. Seeing my own private thoughts laid out like evidence in a case made me feel violated in a way I couldn't articulate. I sat down and went through each item with her, explaining the context Matthew had stripped away. The violent thoughts were me processing normal workplace frustration. The suicidal ideation was me writing about missing my father. Every human emotion had been twisted into pathology. My mother listened carefully, occasionally wiping away tears. She told me that Matthew had seemed so genuinely concerned, so caring. He talked about how he'd helped me through my father's death, how he'd always been there for me. He'd positioned himself as the stable one, the caretaker, the friend who was desperately trying to save me from myself. The manipulation was so sophisticated that even I might have believed it if I hadn't lived through the truth. We spent hours going through my evidence, and slowly, my mother began to see the pattern. She remembered odd moments over the years when Matthew had seemed possessive of my time, when he'd made subtle comments about my girlfriends not being good enough for me. Things that had seemed like protective friendship now took on a different cast. By the time I left, left, she had blocked Matthew's number and promised to call the police if he showed up again. The next morning, I woke up to find my car tires slashed. There was no note, no message, but I knew. The security camera on my apartment building didn't extend to the parking area, so I had no proof. I called a tow truck and tried not to think about how this was escalating. While waiting for the tow, I noticed Matthew's car parked across the street. He was just sitting there, watching. When our eyes met, he raised his hand in a small wave, his expression concerned and sad. I started varying my routines, taking different routes, shopping at different stores, but Matthew always seemed to know where I was. I began to suspect he had placed a tracker on my car, but I couldn't find anything. The paranoia he'd accused me of was becoming real, created by his very actions. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, scanning parking lots for his car, analyzing every interaction for signs of his influence. Jana stood by me through it all, but I could see the strain it was putting on our relationship. Her parents remained skeptical, and Matthew had started sending them regular updates about my condition. He would forward articles about relationship abuse, highlighting passages about how abusers isolate their victims from concerned friends. The irony of him accusing me of the very thing he was doing wasn't lost on me, but it was effective. Jana's parents pushed her to take a break from our relationship, just until things calmed down. We had a long conversation about it one evening. Jana assured me she believed me completely, but she was exhausted from defending our relationship to her family. She was getting messages from numbers she didn't recognize, all expressing concern about her safety. Her co-workers had started asking if everything was okay at home. Matthew's campaign had expanded to her life, and she was beginning to crack under the pressure. I understood her position, but the thought of losing another relationship to Matthew's manipulation made me feel physically ill. We decided to keep our relationship private for a while, not breaking up, but not advertising we were together. It felt like letting Matthew win, but we didn't know what else to do. That night, after Jana left, I sat in my apartment feeling more alone than I had since my father died. The isolation Matthew had been engineering was nearly complete. My work had suggested I extend my leave. My mother was supportive but worried, and now Jana and I were hiding our relationship. Most of my friends had distanced themselves, unsure what to believe. Even Chris, who had experienced Matthew's manipulation firsthand, seemed overwhelmed by the intensity of the situation. He supported me, but admitted he didn't know how to help. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of defending myself, I would go on the offensive. I hired a private investigator, using a chunk of my savings. I explained the situation, showing him my documentation. He seemed skeptical at first, probably thinking this was just drama between former friends, but as he reviewed the evidence, his expression grew more serious. He agreed to look into Matthew's background and see if there were patterns I'd missed. While waiting for the investigator's findings, I focused on rebuilding my life within the constraints Matthew had created. I started working freelance from home, taking on projects that didn't require me to go into an office. I set up multiple security cameras around my apartment, creating a comprehensive surveillance system. I documented every single incident, building a case file that grew thicker by the day. Matthew's tactics evolved in response to my isolation. He started leaving care packages at my door, filled with items that held meaning from our friendship. Photos from college, ticket stubs from concerts we'd attended, even the spare key I'd taken back from him, with a note saying I might need it someday. Each package was accompanied by a letter expressing his deep concern and love for me. The letters were masterfully crafted, painting a picture of a devoted friend watching helplessly as someone he cared about descended into paranoia and isolation. I kept every item, every letter, adding them to my evidence file. The private investigator called with his initial findings. He discovered that Matthew had exhibited similar patterns in high school with another close friend. That friendship had ended abruptly when the friend moved away for college, but the investigator had managed to track him down. The friend, now living across the country, had a disturbing story to tell. The investigator put us in touch, and I spent hours on the phone with McJonathan, Matthew's former best friend. His story was eerily similar to mine. Matthew had sabotaged McJonathan's relationships, interfered with his college applications, and even contacted his parents with concerns about his mental health. The breaking point had come when McJonathan discovered Matthew had been stealing his personal items and creating a shrine of sorts in his room. McJonathan had moved across the country to escape, and Matthew had eventually focused his attention elsewhere, on me, as it turned out. This revelation was both validating and terrifying. Matthew's behavior wasn't new or specific to me. It was a pattern he'd repeated before and would likely repeat again. I asked McJonathan if he'd be willing to write a statement about his experiences, and he agreed. He'd spent years in therapy processing what had happened and was willing to help prevent someone else from going through the same thing. Armed with this new information, I felt a surge of hope. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't alone. Matthew had done this before, and someone else had survived it. I started reaching out to mutual friends again, this time with McJonathan's statement included in my evidence. Some began to reconsider their positions. A few admitted they'd noticed Matthew's possessive behavior over the years, but had dismissed it as quirky friendship. Matthew must have sensed the tide turning because his behavior escalated dramatically. He filed a complaint with my former workplace, claiming I had threatened him. He provided screenshots of messages I'd never sent, masterfully edited to look authentic. My boss called to inform me that they were conducting an investigation and that my return to work was now indefinitely postponed. I was examining the fake messages when I noticed something. The font was slightly off, barely perceptible, but definitely different from my usual messages. It was the kind of detail only someone who'd studied my communications obsessively would notice, or someone looking for evidence of forgery. I hired a digital forensics expert to analyze the messages. It cost more money I couldn't really afford, but I was desperate. The expert confirmed what I'd suspected. The messages were sophisticated forgeries, but they contained digital artifacts that proved they'd been manipulated. I added this report to my growing file of evidence. My apartment was beginning to look like a detective's office, with timelines on the walls and boxes of documentation. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was starting to look exactly like the paranoid person Matthew claimed I was. My therapist became one of my few remaining anchors to sanity. She helped me process the trauma of having someone I'd trusted completely turn my life inside out. We talked about the grief of losing a friendship I thought was genuine, the violation of having my private thoughts weaponized against me, and the exhaustion of constantly defending my reality. She also helped me understand that my documentation and evidence gathering, while necessary, was also a way of maintaining control in a situation where I had very little. One session, she asked me what I hoped to achieve with all my evidence. Did I want Matthew punished? Did I want him to get help? Did I just want him to leave me alone? I realized I wasn't sure anymore. The situation had consumed so much of my life that I'd lost sight of what resolution would even look like. I just knew I couldn't continue living like this. That night, I made a decision. I would compile everything, all the evidence, all the documentation, McJonathan's statement, the forensics report, everything, into a comprehensive package. I would send it to everyone in our mutual circle, to Matthew's family, to anyone who needed to know the truth, not as an attack, but as a defense. I would lay out the facts and let people draw their own conclusions. I spent days putting it together, organizing it chronologically, making it as clear and objective as possible. I included a cover letter explaining that I didn't want to hurt Matthew, but needed to protect myself and prevent this from happening to anyone else. I acknowledged his mental health struggles, but emphasized that they couldn't excuse the harm he was causing. I even included resources for BPD support, hoping someone in his life would help him get proper treatment. As I prepared to send it, Matthew made his boldest move yet. He showed up at my apartment with two people I didn't recognize, introducing them as mental health professionals he'd hired to conduct an intervention. They stood in my doorway, expressing grave concern about my isolation and paranoid behavior. Matthew stood behind them, tears streaming down his face, playing the part of the desperate friend perfectly. I remained calm, knowing my security cameras were recording everything. I politely declined their help and asked them to leave. When they persisted, I showed them my documentation, explaining the situation. The professionals exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them asked Matthew if he had been entering my apartment without permission. Matthew's composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of anger crossing his face before the mask of concern returned. They left after that, but not before one of the professionals quietly handed me her card and suggested I might have grounds for a restraining order. It was the first time someone in a position of authority had validated my experience so directly. I stood in my doorway watching them go, Matthew turning back one last time to look at me with an expression I couldn't read. That night, I sat at my computer with my finger hovering over the send button. The email with all my documentation was ready to go to 37 people. Once I sent it, there would be no going back. Matthew's reputation would be damaged, possibly irreparably. Our mutual friends would have to choose sides. The conflict would escalate from private to public. I thought about the friend Matthew had been, or at least the friend I'd thought he was. I remembered him holding me while I sobbed after my father's diagnosis, driving through the night to bring me to the hospital for one last goodbye. Had that been real? Or had it all been part of some long manipulation? I might never know. But I also thought about McJonathan, who'd had to move across the country to escape. I thought about Faith and Mia, who'd lost relationships because of Matthew's lies. I thought about Jana, hiding our relationship from her parents. I thought about my mother, worried sick about a mental health crisis that didn't exist. I thought about my job, hanging in the balance because of forged messages. The security camera alert on my phone chimed. Matthew was at my door again, but this time he wasn't alone. He had brought my mother. I watched on the feed as he spoke to her urgently, gesturing at my door. My mother looked conflicted, torn between the son she wanted to help and the friend who seemed so concerned. She knocked on my door, calling my name. I opened it to find them both standing there. My mother looked exhausted, and Matthew looked triumphant. He thought he'd found the key to getting through to me. My mother started to speak, but I held up my hand. I invited her in, but told Matthew he needed to leave. He protested, saying he was just trying to help, but I stood firm. My mother looked between us, and in that moment, I saw her make a choice. She stepped inside my apartment and turned to face Matthew. She told him that while she appreciated his concern, she needed to talk to me alone. Matthew's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally back to concern. He agreed to leave, but not before reminding my mother about all the warning signs he documented. After he left, my mother and I sat in silence for a moment. She had come to check on me, she explained, because Matthew's latest visit had worried her. But standing at my door, watching him try to manipulate the situation, she'd suddenly seen what I'd been trying to tell her. The way he'd positioned himself as the gatekeeper to my well-being. The way he'd tried to control her interaction with me. It had finally clicked. She apologized for doubting me and asked to see all my evidence. We spent the rest of the evening going through everything together. She was horrified by the extent of Matthew's invasion into my life, particularly the journal theft and the forged messages. When I showed her McJonathan's statement, she broke down crying. She kept apologizing for not seeing it sooner, for letting Matthew make her doubt her own son. I assured her it wasn't her fault. Matthew was a master manipulator who had fooled everyone. As she prepared to leave, she asked about the email I'd prepared. I showed it to her, and she read through it carefully. When she finished, she looked at me with a mixture of sadness and pride. She said she understood why I needed to send it, and that she would support whatever decision I made, but she also suggested I sleep on it one more night, just to be sure. After she left, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of Matthew's campaign against me. The walls were covered with timelines and documentation. Boxes of printed messages and photographs filled the corners. My life had been consumed by defending myself against someone I'd once trusted completely. I realized that whether or not I sent the email, Matthew had already won in some ways. He'd made me into the isolated, paranoid person he'd claimed I was. But I'd also grown stronger through this ordeal. I'd learned to trust my own perceptions even when everyone doubted them. I'd built a support system of people who believed me. I documented the truth so thoroughly that it couldn't be denied. And most importantly, I'd refused to let Matthew's narrative become my reality. I decided to take my mother's advice and sleep on it. As I lay in bed, I thought about what the next day would bring. Would I send the email and deal with the fallout? Would Matthew escalate further? Would I ever be able to return to work? The uncertainty was exhausting. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over my situation. My phone buzzed with a text from Jana. She decided she didn't care what her parents thought. She was coming over tomorrow to spend the day with me. She was tired of hiding, tired of letting Matthew control our relationship. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. I wasn't alone in this fight. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would send the email. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Matthew's behavior would continue to escalate until someone stopped him. And if that someone had to be me, then so be it. I'd already lost so much to his manipulation. My job, my privacy, my sense of security. I wouldn't lose anything else. The sound of footsteps in the hallway woke me briefly. They paused outside my door, and I held my breath, waiting. But then they continued on, just another neighbor coming home late. The paranoia Matthew had instilled in me would take time to fade, but I was determined to reclaim my life. Tomorrow would be the beginning of that process. I closed my eyes again, knowing that morning would bring new challenges. Matthew wouldn't give up easily, and sending the email would likely provoke a response. But I was ready for whatever came next. I had the truth on my side, and sometimes that's enough. The security cameras would keep watch while I slept, and tomorrow I would take the first step toward ending this nightmare. The next morning, I woke up early and went straight to my computer. The email with all my documentation sat in my drafts folder, ready to expose everything. I clicked send without hesitation. Within minutes, my phone started buzzing with responses. Some people expressed shock, others asked questions, and a few admitted they'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't known what to do. Chris called first, his voice shaky as he processed McJonathan's statement. He'd experienced Matthew's manipulation firsthand, but seeing the pattern repeated with someone else made it undeniable. He offered to share his own experience with our friend group, adding credibility to my claims. I accepted gratefully, knowing that corroboration from multiple sources would be crucial. My mother arrived at my apartment an hour later, bringing coffee and breakfast. She'd received several calls from family friends who'd gotten my email, all expressing concern and support. She helped me organize the responses, creating a spreadsheet to track who believed me, who remained skeptical, and who hadn't responded yet. The systematic approach gave me something to focus on besides the anxiety churning in my stomach. Jana showed up as promised, defying her parents' wishes. She brought her laptop and helped me monitor social media for Matthew's response. We didn't have to wait long. Matthew had created a public post portraying himself as the victim of a smear campaign by someone experiencing severe mental health issues. He included selective screenshots from my journal, painting me as unstable and dangerous. The comments section quickly filled with people who didn't know the full story, offering him sympathy and support. I documented his post and the responses, adding them to my evidence file. Several mutual friends who'd received my email began commenting on Matthew's post, questioning his narrative and sharing their own observations of his behavior. The public nature of the conflict made me uncomfortable, but I recognized it as necessary. Matthew had been operating in shadows for too long. My former boss called that afternoon. He'd reviewed my documentation, particularly the forensics report proving the threatening messages were forged. He apologized for the suspension and offered to expedite my return to work once the situation stabilized. The Human Resources Department would need to complete their investigation, but he assured me my job would be waiting. It was the first concrete sign that the truth was breaking through Matthew's carefully constructed lies. days. The security camera alert chimed, showing Matthew at my door again. This time, he had brought his parents, whom I hadn't seen in years. They looked confused and upset, clearly struggling to understand why their son's best friend would spread such terrible accusations. I watched them knock repeatedly while Matthew stood behind them, his face a mask of hurt confusion. I decided to let them in, but only his parents. I opened the door and politely asked Matthew to wait outside while I spoke with them. His parents hesitated, but I showed them the security camera footage on my phone of Matthew trying to break into my apartment. Their expressions shifted from confusion to concern. They agreed to come in alone while Matthew protested loudly in the hallway. Inside, I showed them everything. The timeline of Matthew's behavior, McJonathan's statement, the forged messages, the stolen journal pages. I explained about his BPD diagnosis and how his fear of abandonment had manifested as controlling behavior. His mother broke down crying, admitting they'd noticed troubling patterns in his friendships growing up, but had hoped he'd outgrow them. His father sat in stunned silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions. They stayed for 2 hours, going through all the evidence methodically. By the end, they understood the severity of the situation. His mother asked for copies of everything, saying they would try to get Matthew into intensive therapy. His father apologized repeatedly for what their son had put me through. They left with heavy hearts, but promised to intervene. Matthew was waiting in the hallway when they emerged. I watched through my security camera as his parents confronted him. His mother held up the printed evidence while his father spoke firmly. Matthew's composure crumbled completely. He began sobbing and shouting, denying everything despite the overwhelming proof. His parents eventually led him away, his mother's arm around his shoulders, while his father carried the box of documentation. Over the next few days, the response to my email continued. Matthew's carefully built narrative began collapsing as more people examined the evidence. Several co-workers apologized for believing his lies and avoiding me. Friends who distanced themselves reached out to reconnect. Even some skeptics admitted that the forensics report and McJonathan's statement were impossible to dismiss. Matthew's social media activity exploded. He posted increasingly frantic messages claiming I'd hacked his accounts, forged evidence, and turned everyone against him. Each post became more unhinged than the last, inadvertently confirming the very instability he'd tried to project onto me. People who'd initially sympathized with him began questioning his credibility as his story constantly shifted. His parents called to update me on their efforts to get him help. They'd scheduled an emergency psychiatric evaluation and were looking into intensive outpatient programs, specializing in personality disorders. They asked if I'd consider not pursuing legal action if Matthew agreed to treatment and ceased all contact. I told them I'd think about it, but my priority was protecting myself and rebuilding my life. My workplace investigation concluded with full exoneration. The forensics report had been crucial in proving the threatening messages were fabricated. My boss personally apologized for the disruption to my career and offered me a flexible return schedule to ease back into work. Several co-workers reached out privately to express support and admit they'd been uncomfortable with Matthew's persistent presence at the office. Jana's parents finally came around after reading through all the evidence. Her mother called to apologize for doubting me, admitting that Matthew's manipulation had been sophisticated enough to fool anyone. They invited me to dinner to make amends, and while the evening was initially awkward, it ended with mutual understanding and respect. Jana no longer had to hide our relationship, which lifted a weight from both our shoulders. The private investigator contacted me with additional findings. He discovered 2 other people from Matthew's past who'd experienced similar patterns of manipulation and sabotage. One was a college roommate who'd moved out suddenly after Matthew began interfering with his relationships. The other was a co-worker from Matthew's first job who'd quit after Matthew spread rumors about his mental health. Both were willing to provide statements if needed. I spent a day organizing all the new information, creating a comprehensive file that documented Matthew's pattern of behavior spanning over a decade. The evidence was overwhelming, showing a clear pattern of targeting close friends and systematically destroying their relationships and credibility when they tried to establish independence. It was both validating and deeply sad to see how many lives Matthew had disrupted. My therapist helped me process the complicated emotions surrounding Matthew's mental illness. While his BPD explained some behaviors, it didn't excuse the calculated nature of his manipulation or the harm he'd caused. We discussed the importance of boundaries and self-protection while still maintaining empathy for someone struggling with mental health issues. It was a difficult balance to strike. Chris organized a gathering of our friend group to address the situation collectively. People shared their experiences with Matthew's manipulation, and several admitted they'd noticed red flags but hadn't known how to address them. We discussed how to support each other moving forward and how to handle Matthew if he attempted to re-enter our social circle. The consensus was firm boundaries and no contact unless he demonstrated genuine change through sustained treatment. Matthew's attempts to contact me gradually decreased as his parents intervened more actively. They'd confiscated his electronic devices and were monitoring his activities while he underwent evaluation. His mother sent me periodic updates, expressing hope that intensive therapy might help him develop healthier relationship patterns. I appreciated their efforts, but remained cautious about any future contact with Matthew. I slowly began dismantling the evidence command center in my apartment. The timelines came down from the walls. The boxes of documentation were archived in my closet. I kept everything organized and accessible, but no longer needed it as a daily reminder of what I'd endured. My apartment began feeling like a home again, rather than a defensive fortress. Returning to work felt surreal after weeks of isolation. My colleagues were welcoming, but clearly curious about the drama that had unfolded. I kept explanations brief and professional, focusing on moving forward rather than rehashing the past. My boss assigned me to lead the project I'd been working on before the suspension, showing confidence in my abilities despite the disruption. Jana and I took a weekend trip to decompress from the intensity of recent events. Being away from the city and all its associations with Matthew felt liberating. We hiked, talked about everything except the drama, and began reconnecting as a couple without the shadow of manipulation hanging over us. It was exactly what we both needed. My mother started joining me for weekly dinners, our relationship stronger for having weathered this crisis together. She admitted she'd been researching personality disorders to better understand what had happened. Her support throughout the ordeal had been invaluable, and these dinners became a cherished routine that helped us both heal from the experience. The security cameras remained installed, but gradually became just another household fixture rather than a vital lifeline. I still checked them occasionally, but no longer obsessively monitored every movement outside my door. The hypervigilance that Matthew had induced was slowly fading as my sense of safety returned. 3 months later, Matthew's mother called with an update. He'd been admitted to a residential treatment program specializing in personality disorders. The initial evaluation had confirmed his BPD diagnosis, along with other concerning patterns. He'd finally acknowledged some of his behaviors were harmful, though he still struggled to take full responsibility. She thanked me again for documenting everything so thoroughly, as it had helped his treatment team understand the severity of his condition. I received a letter from Matthew through his treatment center. It was clearly written under supervision, acknowledging the harm he'd caused and expressing remorse. He wrote about understanding how his fear of abandonment had driven him to destructive behaviors. The letter felt genuine, but also carefully crafted, and I chose not to respond. Some bridges were too damaged to rebuild. McJonathan reached out to check on me, sharing his own healing journey after escaping Matthew's influence. We talked for hours about the unique trauma of having someone you trusted completely turn your life upside down. He'd built a successful life across the country, but admitted certain triggers still affected him. His perspective helped me understand that recovery recovery would be an ongoing process. My relationship with Jana grew stronger through the trial. She'd stood by me when it would have been easier to walk away, and that loyalty deepened our connection. We began making future plans without the constant anxiety of Matthew's interference. Her parents became genuinely supportive, even protective, after understanding the full scope of what we'd endured. Work life normalized as colleagues moved past the drama. I excelled at my project, pouring energy previously spent on defense into productive pursuits. My boss noted my improved focus and creativity, unaware that I was simply returning to my baseline after months of crisis. The stability of routine work felt therapeutic after so much chaos. I decided to keep all the documentation archived but accessible. While I hoped never to need it again, the experience had taught me the value of evidence and preparation. The physical files went into a safety deposit box, with digital copies secured in encrypted cloud storage. It felt like closing a chapter while maintaining necessary precautions. Friends who'd initially been skeptical came around as Matthew's absence from our social circle became permanent. Several apologized for not believing me sooner, admitting they'd been manipulated by his convincing performance of concern. I harbored no resentment, understanding how sophisticated his deception had been. Rebuilding these friendships became part of my healing process. The hypervigilance gradually faded, though certain triggers remained. Unexpected knocks at my door still caused momentary panic. Finding handwritten notes triggered anxiety until I confirmed they were benign. My therapist assured me these responses were normal and would diminish with time and continued healing. As the one-year anniversary of discovering Matthew's betrayal approached, I reflected on how much had changed. My life had stabilized, relationships had been restored and strengthened, and Matthew was receiving long-term treatment. The crisis that had once consumed my every waking moment had become just one part of my history. His parents sent occasional updates about his progress in treatment. He'd been diagnosed with additional conditions beyond BPD and was working through intensive therapy. They remained hopeful but realistic about his long-term prognosis. I appreciated their updates, but maintained firm boundaries about any direct contact. My support network had proven invaluable throughout the ordeal. From Jana's unwavering loyalty to my mother's eventual understanding, from Chris's corroboration to McJonathan's validation, each person had played a crucial role in surviving Matthew's campaign. These relationships, tested by crisis, had emerged stronger and more authentic. I returned to keeping a journal but now stored it in a locked fireproof safe. The violation of having my private thoughts weaponized had been profound, but I refused to let Matthew steal my coping mechanisms permanently. Writing remained therapeutic, helping process both the trauma and the recovery. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about boundaries, trust, and the importance of documentation. While I wouldn't wish such an ordeal on anyone, surviving it had revealed strength I didn't know I possessed. I'd learned to trust my instincts even when others doubted them, and to protect myself without becoming paranoid. Looking forward, I focused on building the life Matthew had tried to destroy. My career was back on track. My relationships were stronger than ever, and my sense of self had been forged in the crucible of crisis. The future held normal challenges and opportunities, no longer overshadowed by manipulation and gaslighting. I occasionally thought about Matthew, hoping he'd find genuine help through treatment. Despite everything, I couldn't hate someone so clearly suffering from mental illness, but I also recognized that his well-being wasn't my responsibility. My focus remained on my own healing and growth. The apartment that had once felt like a fortress now felt like home again. The security cameras remained but no longer dominated my attention. Life had returned to blessed normalcy, with regular workdays, quiet evenings with Jana, and drama-free interactions with friends and family. In quiet moments, I sometimes marveled at the resilience of the human spirit. Matthew had tried to destroy my life through systematic manipulation, yet here I stood, not just surviving, but thriving. The relationships he'd tried to poison had grown stronger. The reputation he'd tried to destroy had been restored. The isolation he'd engineered had given way to deeper connections. My story became a cautionary tale within our friend group about recognizing manipulation and the importance of believing victims of psychological abuse. Several friends thanked me for having the courage to expose Matthew's behavior, saying it had made them more aware of toxic patterns in their own relationships. As I write this, 2 years have passed since that first text from Jana about Matthew's concerning message. The acute crisis has long since resolved, replaced by the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Matthew remains in treatment. His parents report slow but steady progress. Our mutual friends have moved on. The drama now just a distant memory. I've rebuilt everything Matthew tried to destroy and created new things he never could have touched. My relationship with Jana has deepened into something beautiful and trusting. My career has flourished without the constant disruption. My friendships are based on mutual respect rather than manipulation. The hypervigilance has faded to normal caution. The documentation remains archived but untouched. Life has moved forward in all the ways Matthew tried to prevent. His campaign of destruction ultimately failed, serving only to reveal the strength of the connections he sought to sever. Sometimes I pass places that hold memories of our friendship, back when I believed it was genuine. I feel a twinge of sadness for the relationship I thought we had, but no regret for ending it. Some people aren't capable of healthy friendships, and recognizing that isn't cruel, it's necessary self-preservation. My therapist and I concluded our work together last month, both agreeing I'd processed the trauma and developed healthy coping strategies. She commended my resilience and the support network I'd maintained throughout the crisis. Ending therapy felt like a final step in moving beyond Matthew's influence. I share my story not for sympathy, but as testimony that surviving psychological manipulation is possible. That truth, properly documented, can overcome even the most sophisticated deception. That real relationships can withstand attacks from those who would destroy them. And that sometimes the best response to someone's attempt to drive you crazy is simply to remain stubbornly, persistently sane. The boy who cried wolf eventually faced consequences for his lies. Matthew, who cried mental illness about others while refusing to address his own, finally faces his truth in treatment. And I, who he tried to paint as unstable, stand firmly grounded in reality, surrounded by people who see me clearly. Recovery isn't a destination, but a journey. Some days are harder than others, but each day without manipulation, without gaslighting, without someone actively trying to destroy my life is a gift. Matthew gave me an unwanted education in human cruelty, but I graduated with honors in resilience, boundaries, and the power of truth. Those lessons, hard won, now serve me well in a life rebuilt on authentic connections and hard-earned wisdom.